Welcome to the Binge Dietitian podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Sumner, registered dietitian, focusing on helping men and women end binge eating, end food guilt, and finally say yes to life. This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not substitute for medical and personalized advice. Hi guys, Jonathan here, the Binge Dietitian. I just first want to thank all of you so much for all the support you've been giving me and the messages I've received since starting this podcast. I'm just so excited for the future episodes and many more guests to have in this podcast. But let's get straight to the topic. Let's talk about motivation during binge eating recovery. So let's say at the moment that you're doing really well with binge eating recovery. You're implementing regular meals, honoring your hunger, and being mindful of the meals you eat. And then all of a sudden, you just hit this slump. You start to lose motivation. You start to think, was my life better if I was just chasing weight loss? Is it truly worth it? Well, if this is you, I completely understand. And I want you to know that you don't ever have to be ashamed or confused with yourself if you're having these thoughts. It just simply means that you're challenging these thoughts. You're challenging the binge eating disorder. If you're struggling to find motivation to keep going, I want you to keep an eye on the progress. Sure, if you're aiming for weight change, we can measure it by a number on the scale during binge eating recovery. But during binge recovery, the scale is not what we should be looking at. It's really common, and sometimes you can get into this habit of focusing on numbers. But with binge eating recovery, it's not about the numbers. Here's 3 ways to measure your progress with binge eating recovery. Number 1, I want you to think, are your binge episodes becoming less frequent? Are the gaps in between your binges getting longer? When we binge, most of us think of being a failure. I've ruined it. You might be thinking, I'm failing. But I want you to know, it's okay to feel that way. But it's not your fault for feeling that way. When we struggle with binges, it's also common to also struggle with the all or nothing thinking. This all or nothing thinking is where you start to think you're either eating perfectly or you're not eating perfectly. You're eating good or eating bad foods. You can stay on track or you're not on track. But let's escape this mindset, because eating is never black and white. Success is never black and white. I want you to know that binge eating recovery takes time. I want you to look at how often you're binging now. Do you used to binge every 3 days, but now you see the trend that you're binging every 5 days? Well, that's a massive improvement. Let's not focus on the binges. Let's focus on how great the gaps are, because that means you're having more days where you're eating normally. You're probably enjoying the foods you love. You're really savoring and exploring different flavors. That's the massive improvement. And being realistic, we can't expect to be binge-free the next morning you wake up and never binge again. It doesn't usually happen. And if that's what happens in your case, then I'm really happy for you and well done. So you can measure your progress of your binge eating recovery by how often you're not binging. And I want you to know, though, that in the end, it's just going to be so worth it. I can truly say that your life will turn upside down in the best way possible. What I can promise you is that you'll start to feel the mental benefits of having this burden of thinking about food, thinking about diets, thinking about numbers, what your body looks like, your clothes fitting. You'll start to be free from these burdens that are weighing you down. You'll have more headspace to explore and focus on things that you truly love in life, like your hobbies, time with family, time with friends. You can do things you wish you wanted to do, but you just felt so exhausted, mentally exhausted. Some people start to go to college or university. They start to go on holidays more now that they're not mentally being brought down by shame guilt, thinking that they're not good enough. And it could be really soon. For some people, it may take a little bit longer. But remember that your progress is in the trend. And no matter how small the achievement may seem to you, it's going to contribute massively to your recovery. If you're finding it difficult to stay motivated, then it might be helpful for you to keep a little log or a little booklet to see how often you're binging, how long are the gaps in between binges. Number 2, to measure your binge eating recovery progress, how do you feel around food? Are you starting to not feel guilty around food? How do you feel before you start eat? Does it give you anxiety? Does it make you feel bad? Or do you start to feel relaxed? Do you start to look forward to these flavors, the experience, the way it smells, the way it tastes? If you've been struggling with binge eating for so long, sometimes these ideas sound very strange, where you start to feel relaxed before or after eating food. You start to look forward to certain food, because if we've been binging and restricting, then everything around food revolves around guilt. But if you're starting to relax around food, start to look forward to food being served to you, there's no more guilt before or after, or much less guilt than usual before and after, then that's a clear sign that you're recovering really well with binge eating. If you're struggling to measure this, what I would suggest is to keep a little food diary. How do you feel after eating a chocolate muffin, for example? And what I want you to do is to write 3 columns. The leftmost column is for the name of the food, which is the chocolate muffin. In the middle column, how did it make you feel after eating it? Anxious? Guilty? Didn't feel anything? It's all right if you don't feel anything, because sometimes that could be a good thing. And the rightmost column, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being considered a safe food, and number 1 being a fear food, where would it lie in the scale? If you start to use a food diary and reflect on certain foods with how it makes you feel and how safe you start to feel around them, you might sometimes surprise yourself after exposing yourself around these foods. And truly, you might be surprised how quickly you could sometimes feel safe around these foods. Sometimes it may take a little bit longer, and that's okay. What we try to focus on is progress. Any progress is the best progress ever. You're getting one step closer to being binge-free and removing these mental burdens in your mind. It may sound like a bit of work, but remember, you won't have to use the diary forever. You won't have to keep on tracking foods. This is just a really good way for you to measure how your recovery is going and how safe you feel around these foods. And finally, number 3, you can measure your binge eating recovery progress by how you're slowly detaching from the numbers. You'll start to notice that your worth is not determined by a number on the scale, how much food you think you should eat, your waist size, and your sins. You'll start to find joy in the moments you spend with friends, family, social events, and hobbies. You won't start to space out thinking about calories or when you can next restrict or make up for this meal, because you're so in the moment and you truly enjoy social events instead of it being replaced by guilt afterwards. This can do wonders for your mental health. After detaching yourself from numbers, you'll start to feel like a kid again, wherein, for example, every time we open a lunchbox, we start to get really excited with what's being offered to us. You'll start to go to restaurants with friends and family, or maybe even on your own, and not Google the menu right beforehand about what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat. Start to notice how colorful your life is when you're not attached and defined by a number. So if you feel like you're struggling with motivation, then these 3 ways to measure your binge eating recovery progress will do wonders for your motivation. And it's a great way to monitor how well you're recovering. Number 1, are the gaps in between your binges getting longer? Number 2, how do you feel around food? Do you start to feel safe around food? Does it not cause as much anxiety as it used to? Number 3, do you start to notice that you're detaching yourself from the numbers? your clothes size, you start to feel that you're more present in the moment, and you start to have this mental space for other things such as hobbies, dancing, doing the things you truly love. That could also be food. You can love food and you can love eating and still have a lovely, enjoyable relationship with food. Let's not make it a love-hate relationship. So that's that episode of Binge Dietitian. And I hope you really took something out of this. And I want to also remind you that no matter where you are in recovery, it truly is possible to be binge free. And there's always light in the tunnel, no matter what it may seem like. I would really appreciate it if you rated this podcast, and if you would want to work one-to-one with me so I can help end your binges and start to work with you in measuring your progress and also to celebrate your wins. As we mentioned in this episode, you can book a free call with me in the link in the description of this podcast. All right. See you next time, guys. If you found this podcast helpful, you would definitely benefit from my binge eating freedom course in my website, bingedietitian.com. Learn more about the triggers to why you're binge eating and how to stop binge eating for good. No more food guilt, no more jumping from diet to diet, and no more shame. Go to the link in this episode for my binge eating freedom course to be one step closer to being binge free, starting today.